When I was much younger, exploring the world of the woods was something that I loved to do. I would often go off on my own, despite my parents' warnings, and get lost in the beauty of nature. It was on one of these occasions that I met June. She was unlike anyone I had ever met before. She was beautiful, wild yet somehow calm, and such a free spirit with a look of wisdom in her eyes. I could tell she had explored these woods her entire life and somehow didn't have the same wonderment that I had. The forest was her backyard, it was her home. We became fast friends. My family was only staying for 3 days and 2 nights this time. I met her on the first day. I told her about my life having parents that were separated when I was 5, and she would tell me joyless stories about her parents between long moments of silence. I was entranced by her even more than I had originally been entranced by the forest. It felt as though nature had delivered her to me as it had delivered many other wonders of nature. I fell in love with her almost instantly, but we parted ways in the forest before I ever even learned her name. I went back to camp and had dinner and slept, thinking only of her the entire time. The next day I woke up early, which was very unlike me. Normally I would sleep in my tent until it got too hot to stay in, but this morning was different. I was up early enough to eat some campfire breakfast with my stepdad, then almost immediately I started out on one of my usual forest nature journeys. This time I wasn't heading in a random direction. This time I knew exactly where I was going. I wanted at least one last glimpse of my new friend. I wanted to find her immediately and spend as much time with her as possible. I arrived back at the same spot in the woods where I had found her. This area was somewhere I had explored many times before and it was not very difficult to find. My new friend was not there, but I had a feeling that maybe she had the same thoughts as me, and if I stayed here she would arrive eventually. Around my feet there were many interesting rocks, pieces of wood, and the occasional piece of old metal that one finds in these places. Huge boulders were everywhere around here and they formed interesting shapes and had interesting divots and holes. You could easily spend hours if not days in any square foot of this place without ever getting bored if you simply looked close at the geology and even the wildlife. If you sit quietly, the birds and squirrels eventually start to ignore you and forage closer and closer to you. After spending several hours in a relatively small area of the forest, I eventually started realizing that the chances of actually meeting my new friend in this same place was relatively small. I also knew that the chances were even less if I started exploring again in random places, but my patience had run its course. I started spiraling out farther and farther away, not sure where I was going exactly, but starting to realize that I was getting hungry. It was time to start heading back into the town or back to my camp. They were both in the same direction and I started navigating in a winding pattern back in that general direction. As I wandered somewhat aimlessly, my thoughts turned to the many small cabin buildings that surrounded the center of this small town. On the main drag there was only a saloon, a fire station, and a general store. But around this were small cabins. My best chance of seeing any person was to explore around these cabins. Maybe she lives in one of them, I thought. Maybe I'll get a sighting of her nearby. At this point my hopes were getting lower and lower and I was starting to second guess my infatuation with this girl. There was no taking back my feelings, but I was realizing that I might never see her again in my life and there was no point in letting myself get worked up about it no matter what happens. I turned around and saw her, even more beautiful than the first time we met. Her golden brown hair was even more flowing and serene and her smile made me feel a spark inside. She remembered me and she was excited to see me again. I didn't even hug her. I was too afraid of scaring her away. At this point I was very young and afraid of doing the wrong thing around girls. All I wanted was to hang out and explore nature together with her. As if we both had the same thoughts, we began wandering back deeper into the woods together in silence. Occasionally we would share smiling glances at each other while we walked farther and farther up each bank of a small stream. Eventually the silence became deafening as it became very apparent that something was not right. The feeling that we were sharing thoughts became more and more vibrant. We didn't have a supernatural exchange of sentences or paragraphs, but each of us could communicate feelings by just looking at each other and from being around each other. I started to feel like there was something wrong with her home life, but I couldn't ask out of the blue. I couldn't be certain that she was having the same feelings as me. Eventually our paths were clearly leading us back to where she had spotted me today. By one of the cabins on the stream we were following. She said, "I have to go," with a somewhat somber look on her face. I held back my feelings of wanting to stay together longer and said, "Okay." She turned around to walk towards the cabin. I realized this must be her home. Now I wanted to know more and asked, "What is your name?" She turned and replied with a smile, "June." I watched her walk away from me toward the cabin for a few paces, then I started on my way back toward my camp. I remember on the last day of our camping trip I explored some of the town's surroundings and some of the woods around her cabin but did not spot her. I never worked up the courage to knock on the door of what I thought was her cabin and ask for her. I had a lingering feeling that I wasn't welcome and could cause problems for her if I did. Back in my life down in the city 2 years passed. Normally we would go camping more than once a year, but for some reason 2 passed before we were able to get back up there. At first I yearned to be back in the woods, but I was busy with school and my social life. I eventually had other things on my mind. One day, out of the blue, my mom told me we were finally going back to camp in this town. I immediately was flooded with feelings I hadn't felt for the last 2 years. Flashes of these memories came back all at once and I suddenly wanted to go camping more than I had ever before, and I always loved camping. After a couple of weeks we were back up at the campsite and all set up, and I hurriedly found my way back to the spot where we had first met. I tried for 10 minutes to just stay and enjoy the woods and the nature as I had always done, but this time there was only one thing on my mind: June. I explored the small town, bought some fudge from the general store. I solemnly explored and sat around in various places while thinking of what I could possibly do to recreate this chance encounter. Eventually I couldn't help but go closer and closer to the stream and the cabin where I knew she lived. I tried to work up the courage to eventually knock on the door and ask, "Is June home?" But I didn't know for sure that she even lived there or what the repercussions would be of some city boy asking around about their daughter. Right as I began to realize I would likely never see June again, I encountered an older woman on a path in the woods who was curious about my apparent aimlessness. She inquired, "Hey there, how's it going?" I blurted out without much thought, "Oh, I'm just looking for a friend that I made a few years ago, I think." This stranger looked at me perplexed and glanced over at the cabin. At this point I noticed it wasn't exactly the best looking cabin in the woods. It was simple, with one floor. The wood logs it was made of were dark without any paneling. The window panes appeared uncleaned. It was mostly featureless with no deck out front and only a very short awning over the front where the door was. The stranger asked me, "What's their name? I probably know them." "June," I replied. I don't know anyone named June." The stranger looked back at the cabin again, but with a perplexed look. "Do you know where she lives?" "I'm not sure, but I think she lives in that cabin there." I looked as if to point at the cabin. The stranger's eyebrows furrowed. "Well, I doubt she lived there. Nobody has lived there for years." "Well, I haven't seen her for 2 years. I met her here last time my family and I came camping here a couple years ago." As I responded, I could tell the stranger was beginning to lose interest. Maybe I was boring her, but it seemed more like I was dredging up a sensitive subject. She said, "Well, unless you met her more than 9 years ago, I doubt it was her. There was a little girl and her father living in that cabin, but they both died in a fire. Just look." She then started back on her path and walked away from me as if to avoid whatever conversation may have come next. I looked closer at the cabin, confused. The cabin was there. If it burned down, then why is it still here? Then I slowly walked around the cabin and noticed there was burn damage. An entire corner was very obviously missing from fire damage. My entire body felt numb as a cold sense of dread came over me. As if I was having a shared thought with June, I realized this was her home, but the June I met was never who I thought she was. I spent the rest of the camping trip completely lethargic, lost in thought, trying to decide what had happened. I considered asking other adults about what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to learn the truth. I wanted to mourn her death, but I still wasn't completely sure of what was going on. Slowly I distanced myself from this place and realized that I might never know. Sometimes I still visit this small town with that thought of June in my mind and what might have been. What had actually happened to her? What happened to me?